I was just reflecting, when my first experience with evening prayer was probably, spring of 1986. And the parish in Manchester only knew the sixth tone for Lord to You I Call, right? Many of our parishes are like that. So the one we sang tonight was the first one I ever learned. And it still speaks to me, Vespers is one of the most beautiful and one of the most evangelistic services that we have. I've had more people become Melkite because of evening prayer. It's just, So anyway, very, very beautiful. So we've been talking the last couple of months about the various pillars of our Way program. And it's very good we have kind of dovetailed. So last month we talked about the Divine Liturgy, and this month we talk about the Eucharist itself. And so last month I talked kind of about the dynamics of worshiping God and how God in the Old Testament wanted to be worshipped. This month I'm talking specifically about the Eucharist. And for those of you who are watching at home, I've passed out a sheet because I'm going to make reference to a lot of scriptural passages tonight, and we'll see if we can post that on the website when this video goes on the website as well. So the first and most important thing that we have to understand in terms of Old Testament forebears or kind of foreshadowing of the Eucharist is the whole dynamic of covenant. I mean, really, the whole Old Testament is about covenant with God, right? In fact, another way of saying it is the book of the Old Covenant. Not, the Old Testament and the Old Covenant are kind of interchangeable there. And so, in the Old Testament, there are 6 covenants that are made between God and His people. And I want to very briefly kind of go through them. And then to talk a little bit more broadly about how all of that connects with our experience as Christians. So the first, of course, was the covenant of Adam and Eve, right? That God would be with humanity as long as they don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And they did, and so they were expelled from the garden, right? Which, of course, that sin broke the harmony and the beauty of all of creation, right? So that God's interaction with humans and humans' interaction with the rest of the world, all of that was now disjointed because of sin. The second covenant He made was with Noah, right, where He kind of reset, wiped the slate clean because everyone was so sinful, and Noah and his family and a pair of every animal, except for the unicorn apparently, all got on the ark together. It's funny because if you ever go to a monastery, the monks use a big long plank called the simandron, right, to summon. They have a little hammer, and so it sounds like and they'll walk through the monastery, and boy, it does wake you up, believe me. At 5 a.m, it wakes you up. But years ago, I would take my dog Saeed out there, and Saeed was terrified of the thing, so I always used to laugh that Saeed would have been left off the ark, because the tradition was that Noah used the simandron to summon all the animals to the ark. Saeed would have not made it on the ark, unfortunately. But so that whole dynamic that God said, from here, I've made a covenant with Noah and with his descendants that never again will I wipe the earth clean. Now, perhaps one of the most important covenants is that with Abram, and that is in Genesis 15, verse 7, the beginning, where Abram has moved his entire clan from Ur of the Chaldees to essentially to the Promised Land, and God has promised him, if he will be faithful, that he will be the father of many nations. So his name changes from Abram to Abraham. And I'll come back to that one in just a second, because each of the covenants has a sign, right? And the sign of the covenant is very important. In Exodus chapters 19 through 24, God makes a covenant with Moses and with the people on Mount Sinai. And this one's really kind of interesting because, in popular culture, we see the two tablets of the Ten Commandments, right? And, they'll often say, like, Commandment 1, 2, and 3 on one, and the rest of them on the other one. Well, in fact, in the ancient world, when you were a powerful ruler, and you had either conquered or kind of made a pact, made a covenant with a vassal, with a less powerful ruler, you would make, it makes good legal sense, right? You'd make two copies of the agreement. One would go in your treasury, in your temple, and one would go in the temple of the vassal, right? The one who had been conquered or had, asked for help or whatever it was. And especially if, the king who was the vassal, who was the conquered one, if that's what had happened, it was usually stipulated that he had to bring that tablet out once a year on the anniversary of that and read it to all the people again, right? It's a way of keeping him in line. Well, so now, why we have two tablets, but because the temple of the people and the temple of the great king making the covenant are the same, right? Both of the tablets ended up in the Ark of the Covenant because both the vassal and the great king were the same people. Does that make sense? So that covenant we'll come back to as well. In 2 Samuel, beginning in chapter 7, King David is given a covenant. And, David starts by saying he wants to build a house for the Lord. And God says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Just you'll be my people and I'll be your God. We'll continue on. And of course, then Solomon's able to build the temple later, but David does not. Finally, the prophet Jeremiah makes reference to the last of the covenants, and he makes reference to a new covenant. And we sometimes see that as a precursor for the new covenant that Jesus makes with us in his own blood. Okay, that it's the segue from the book of the Old Covenant to the book of the New Covenant. Right, so the New Testament is about that new covenant that Jesus makes at the Last Supper, which kind of takes everybody by surprise because he takes the traditional Jewish meal and he transforms it forever. Now, so the reason I said I would come back to a couple of them. So quite often the sign of the covenant was in blood, and it could be quite elaborate, in terms of the shedding of the blood of animals and so forth. Blood, again, was regarded as being life itself. Especially before you have a sense of medical science and so forth. If you lost a lot of blood, you died. So it made sense that blood is life, which is not that far off, to be honest. And so because this was this oath was sacred, it would be marked by the shedding of blood quite often. And of course now that is important because the new covenant, the New Testament, is marked by the blood not of lambs, but of the Lamb of God. Right? There's a couple of interesting references. So in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, there's a reference to this king named Melchizedek. And he comes out and he just kind of, out of nowhere, offers bread and wine. He is a priest of the Most High God, and he offers bread and wine to Abraham. And then, and he's kind of gone. But he comes back up again, in the letter to the Hebrews and in Psalm 110, I believe it is, talking about, so, I'm a priest in the order of Melchizedek, right? That my priesthood extends back to this priest who offered bread and wine. And that, again, is important because that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus used bread and wine that would have been used at the standard Jewish meal, and there would have been blessings, said over that bread and that wine. And he transforms that and says, now this new covenant is made in my blood. This cup is not just wine anymore; it's the cup of my blood. So he sealed the covenant with his own blood, rather than the blood of lambs or doves or anything else. We can also see in the Eucharist reference to the Passover, right? That in the book of Exodus, and I think I gave you the reference, I didn't give myself the reference here. I think it's Exodus 12. Exodus 12. We have this Passover meal, which is eaten in haste so that the people can go pass through the Red Sea, which of course is an image of baptism, from slavery to freedom. And so we can see in this meal an image of the Eucharist, that it promises life, it gives us life and freedom. And then also in the desert, the people were starving, and Moses called to God, and God rained down this manna. And there's been lots and lots of ink spilt on what this manna might have been. Some scientists think they've found little, naturally growing things that could have been something like the manna or whatever. But, for our purposes, the point is that the manna came. God gave it to the people so that they would have bread from heaven. Literally, they would have something to eat. And they couldn't store it, right? They couldn't hoard it. They had to, they could take what was enough for them, and that was it. So that they learned to be dependent on God. Except on the Sabbath, they were allowed to keep enough for the Sabbath as well. But aside from that, there were some people, of course, because human nature is what it is, who tried to hoard the manna, and it just got wormy right away. And so, in the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Give us this day our daily bread." I mean, it reminds us that ultimately we can plan, we can save, all of these things. I mean, ultimately it's God who gives us all good things. And in the Eucharist, God gives us everything we need, right? God gives us literally with the bread from heaven, all of the nourishment and the sustenance that we need for our spiritual lives. And then finally, there's a reference in Exodus 25 to the bread of the presence, which was bread that was given, for the priests in the temple. And so again, it's another kind of Eucharistic reference, to bread, the element of bread. Again, in Judaism, or really in the ancient world, when you said bread and wine, it was kind of like we talk about meat and potatoes today. Bread and wine was the standard food. Bread was, we hadn't beaten all the nutrients out of bread at that point. So there was actually protein and, everything you needed. You could live on bread. Today you just end up with diabetes. But in those days you could eat bread. You could live on bread because it was substantial. And, typically you didn't drink a whole lot of water because you had to make sure the water was purified. The people would get sick oftentimes because of the microbes and things in the water. So you typically drank wine. And so, when in Judaism, these two elements were blessed as a part of their ritual meals because they were the basic staple foods. And Jesus takes those two basic staple foods and he transforms them, to say that, now he is the basis, of life. He is the source of all life. So in all of that, and I've kind of run through them all quickly, but I left them for you to be able to kind of take your time and go and read through each of the passages, especially as you're developing your lessons and talking about the Eucharist, and especially in this time of preparation for Christmas, you might be able to work in some of the references, or one or two of the references, to be able to kind of fill out what our children experience in terms of the Eucharist. Some of these passages may be very helpful to inspire them. So, questions, comments?
Father, I always thought it was interesting. This is the gospel according to Rose, which means nothing. But I always thought it was interesting. There's one box to drink the blood in there.
Right.
And then, of course, when Jesus says you must drink the blood in there. And I always thought to myself that the reason there was a prohibition against it from the beginning was because the only thing that's going to give you life was going to be Jesus' life. So you don't eat the blood of animals. You have to eat the blood that is actually going to give you life, which is Jesus. So I don't know if that was part of the reason.
So just in case folks who are watching at home didn't hear all of that, what Rose was saying was that the blood of the sacrifices in the Old Testament you didn't drink, right? That you didn't partake of that. And in fact, the kosher laws in Judaism even today say that you do not ever taste blood. Meat that's been prepared kosher has had the blood drained from it in a way, and also the animal's been slaughtered in a humane way as well. And so the first time you're actually consuming blood is Jesus' blood. And of course, that's, when you look at the Gospel of John chapter 6, right? I'm talking about the Old Testament references here, but that's why so many people were grossed out and left, right? Because Jesus doesn't just say, eat my flesh and drink my blood. He uses a word that means like feed on it, gnaw on it, So he's really trying to, push at him.
He was separating sheep and goats then.
Huh?
He was already separating his sheep and his goats.
He was exactly, but he was trying to get them to think in new terms, right? He was trying to open the box a little bit and get them to think outside the box. But that's it. That's exactly why, because you just didn't have any contact with blood. You didn't. Never mind drink it. You didn't even touch it. Which is why this whole idea of being unclean. It wasn't so much that, like when we hear unclean, we think of something that's dirty. In the end, what it really meant was that because you had touched life itself, something sacred, that you were out of sync with everybody else. You were out of sync with the regular world, and had to have a time of kind of being reintegrated. So was it last Sunday we read the man who was beat up on the road? Well, why did the priest and the Levite walk by? Because there was blood. And if they had touched the blood, they wouldn't have been able to go in and do their thing in the temple or whatever, because they would have been rendered for a period of time unclean. And the Samaritan didn't have that concern. But also, of course, the impact of that story is that when Jesus talked about the Samaritan, everyone listening to him expected that the Samaritan came in and finished the guy off because they were mortal enemies. So the impact of that story is that this guy who's a mortal enemy to a Jew goes way out of his way to take care of him. But again, it's all that about blood.
Okay, I have another question. When the high priest would determine which of the two animals was going to be the one that the sacrifice would determine, and then the scapegoat. Okay. I know the scapegoat was let go into the wilderness. The animal that was killed and the blood poured on the altar, did they eat that animal?
I'd have to go back and look specifically, but usually there's very strict, certain parts of it are sacrificed in the fire.
Right.
and then, yeah, the priest would consume,
Okay, that's what I was.
like it was basically for the consumption of the priests.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, there's a couple of different places where those prescriptions are made, so we'd have to go back and look really specifically. But yeah, it wasn't wasted. But there are certain, and there were whole burnt offerings too. I mean, there were offerings that prescribed that everything was burned, but typically it was like parts of the body were burned, and then some was cooked and prepared for the priests. Good question.
And the showbread was strictly for the priest, and it was replaced every day by new loaves?
I believe so, yes. Which was why, was it David had his men go in and eat it? Yeah, which was that was why it was a big deal. I mean, Jesus makes reference to that. Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Pardon me? Sheets? Oh, you have a bunch of okay. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I'm going to shut off the live stream so that we don't have a lot of dead space. I thank you very much. Like I said, I apologize for kind of loading you down with scriptural references, but wanted to kind of provide it all in one place for you to do your own meditation in your own preparation for your classes. Thank you.